You're not picking me up that much, is it?
Yeah, no, good.
It is? Yes.
Good now.
So my name is Caroline Spiranovic. I'm a research fellow here in the law faculty. And today I have chosen a provocative title, hopefully get a few people in. So that was lock them up and throw away the key. Is that what the public really want? But before I launch into talking about public opinion straight away, I want to give you just a little bit of a context or background so that you can sort of, I suppose, situate that whole area of public opinion in the broader context and understand why it's a relevant issue, why it's important. So to do that, I want to talk about money. We spend a lot of money on the criminal justice system. The Productivity Commission annually produce a report on government services, and the latest report indicated that in the 2000 to 2014 financial year, if you include how much we spend on the Australian Federal Police as well as the High Court, we spend over $16 billion annually on our criminal justice system. And also that figure has been increasing over the years. I was looking just recently at the last few years, and there's approximately a 2% increase annually. So that's starting to add up, obviously, over the years. And the other thing is, coinciding with that, our imprisonment rates have just skyrocketed here in Australia. It's not unique to Australia. This is something we're seeing in many Western developed countries. When you look at our imprisonment rates, they've more than doubled in the last couple of decades since 1995. So currently, the Australian Bureau of Statistics' latest data from March this year indicates that we've reached an all-time high of over 35,000 prisoners now in Australia. And it's probably no surprise to many of you that prison costs a lot of money. If you look at how much it costs for the average prisoner per day, it's $220 for an adult prisoner. So that adds up to more than 80 grand per year per prisoner here in Australia. And if you look at how many prisoners we've currently got, over 35,000, we're getting to almost $3 billion per year in just locking people up. So that's $3 billion less that we have for other essential services. $3 billion less that we have for education. $3 billion less than we have for health. That's quite relevant when you take into consideration the fact that a lot of offenders come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So often they do have a lower level of education, lower levels of opportunities, of skills. They quite often are more likely to have mental health problems, substance abuse problems, etc. So there's some debate, I suppose, to say that that money could be perhaps better well spent. But so I just wanted to give you a little bit of a context for where public opinion comes in. So as part of this, obviously, looking at our imprisonment rates and how much we spend is the whole move that we've seen in many Western nations, including Australia, towards increasingly tough penalties for offenders. So we're seeing longer prison terms, we're also seeing more prison sentences being given out. So that adds up to more people in prison and greater costs. So in particular, it's all relevant in terms of understanding why public opinion matters, because when things like mandatory sentencing are introduced, public opinion is often cited as one of the primary drivers for these sort of moves. So public opinion does matter. But what I want to talk about a little bit is what public opinion really looks like in this area. So, I mean, a lot of you probably, I'm not sure how many sort of people have a background in this and know a little bit about what public opinion may show us, but certainly the media suggests that we want blood. We want more people in prison, we want them in prison for longer. And in fact, if you look at the research, it suggests that it's a little bit more complicated than this, because a lot of the responses we get are highly influenced by the types of questions we ask and also who we ask them of. So, one example, for instance, is if I were to ask, in general, whether you think sentencing is too lenient, too tough, or about right. When we ask that question, approximately 2/3 of the population would agree that it's too lenient. And that's across Australia, Canada, US. It's a pretty consistent sort of finding. So that would suggest certainly that the public are not happy, that they want tougher sentences. Also, if we asked, for instance, whether we need stiffer sentences for those that break the law, we get approximately 2/3, just over 60%, would agree with that statement. A a similar figure for whether the courts are too soft. All of this kind of adds up to think, yep, certainly the courts aren't getting it right, we do need tougher sentences. But it's not that easy. If you look at those questions, you can see that they're very generalised for one. There's absolutely no context. The respondents are not encouraged to think about the issues more deeply, or even certainly as politicians would, to try and trade things off, to consider, are we going to spend less money on education, less money on health, and more money on our criminal justice system? So that sort of context is really important. And I can demonstrate that even with a national study that I was involved in a few years ago, led by Geraldine McKenzie, where we asked over 6,005 Australians all sorts of questions about their perceptions on sentencing. And one of them, of course, was these generic questions on, to what extent you think we need stiffer sentences, etc. And as you'd expect, over 60% agree with those statements. Yet, those exact same people, when we asked them, were they willing to consider alternatives to prison, for instance, community corrections orders, supervision, treatment in the community, that really reversed on its head. So what we found is over 80% were willing to support those sort of alternatives for young offenders, for people with mental illness, and over 60% were willing to support those sort of alternatives for non-violent offenders, etc. So it's not that easy to necessarily just assume that the public do want harsher sentences, because when you're encouraging them to think a little bit more, you get very different responses. And that has really been highlighted for us in particular by research Kate Warner herself has been leading, looking in particular at jurors' perceptions of sentencing. And so the real value, I suppose, in adding this to the equation is you're looking at people that have been involved in a real criminal trial. They get a sense for the offender as a real person, and they also have all that contextual information. They know about the offender's life, they know about the situation that led to the offence, they know about what the interaction was between the victim and offender, etc. So they've got a lot more specific contextual information to consider. And our recent study, sort of hot off the press, looking at Victorian jurors, over 900 of them in particular, when we interviewed these jurors and when we give them a number of surveys, at the very start, before they know what the judge's sentence is, we ask them to actually recommend what they think would be the appropriate sentence for the offender in their trial, and then compare that with the actual sentence that the judge gave. And when we do that, I'm not sure if this would be surprising to you, but 62% of jurors chose a more lenient sentence than the judge in their trial. But it does vary. It does depend on the type of offence as well. So we find in particular that they're a bit more divided when it comes to sex offences. It was more like a 50-50 split between those that were more lenient, those that were more severe. So this suggests that, perhaps there is something there, and that has prompted a national study led by Kate Warner, looking into juror perceptions for those that have been involved just in sex offence trials nationally. So getting a national sample, that's going to allow us to get a broader range of offences, so we can try and understand what it is exactly about sex offences that can influence juror perceptions and sentencing. And of course, so this, I suppose, all adds up to, therefore, being more wary of just assuming that the public do want harsher sentences, that is really the appropriate way to go. It's obviously the more context people have, the more they think about the situation, the more likely they actually are to often agree with the judge and think that we are getting it right. So you could argue that politicians maybe have a bit of an obligation to try and be, I suppose, come up with decisions that are more ethically defensible, that are more in line with public opinion, and to try and treat the public on a more respectful level, to really engage with them as, intellectual people that are capable of reasoning through and engaging with them on that level to see what their views are. And that's really all I wanted to say today, so thank you for your time.